Hello, and welcome to the Savvy Seat Show. I'm your host, Marco Ouden, and with me today in the studios, well, actually not in the studios, they're across the ocean, Vinay Kolhatkar and Roger Bissell, authors of a recently published book called Modernizing Aristotle's Ethics. I read the book, and it's an excellent book. It really puts a new light on ethics in our time. And I'd like to ask both of you to give a short overview of what your objectives were and how you went about getting there, working together. Let's start with Vinay.
Oh, firstly, thank you for your compliments, Marco, about the achievement and as you said in your review, new spin on ethics. So I would like to start by emphasizing that we do stand on the shoulders of intellectual giants that preceded us: Aristotle, Aquinas, Ayn Rand. For me personally, more influences insofar as this book is concerned: psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, psychologists Julian Jaynes, Nathaniel Branden, and Abe Maslow. My objective was to first arrive at the ontology of a human being in a complete compendium of human psychological needs and a very brief overview of the physiological needs, which I attempted in chapter 3. And I came up with 12 needs, even though relationships of all kinds was collated into one need. The second objective was to use that ontology of a human being and Rogers' chapter 4 into a ethics of a meaningful life, or a humane meaningful life. And the third objective was to extend the ethics into politics. And in terms of how we went about it, four chapters were written individually, two by me, two by Roger, but we acted as the devil's advocate for each other, as the editor and as a sounding board, and that worked out extremely well.
Roger, do you have anything to add?
Well, sure. You'll just have to tell me when to stop adding. I had three objectives. First of all, I wanted to show how powerful that the true parts of Aristotle's ethics and biology are. And secondly, to show how much we owe Thomas Aquinas for bringing these ideas to the modern world. And that was what I set out to do in chapter 2, primarily. And thirdly, I wanted to show just how Aristotelian and how fertile Ayn Rand's ethical ideas are, as well as her idea about the basic importance of your pre-philosophical worldview. Now, that was what I went into in chapter 4. By pre-philosophical worldview, I'm talking about your basic view of life and the world that you grope for long before you get around to adopting a formal ethics and philosophy. Rand had a different name for it, but I simply call it deep meaning or deep meaningfulness. And based on this worldview, we then do two very important things. We eventually, as we're reaching maturity, reaching adulthood, we look for, try to find an ethics that makes the most sense and hopefully fits our worldview. And then, secondly, if we really value being in control of our lives and not just drifting along, we will use that worldview as a foundation for our central life purpose, which is the personal meaning of our lives. And to me, this stress that Vinay and I set out to put for ethics on meaningfulness, both deep meaning and personal meaning, was one of the two vital parts of how we were going to modernize Aristotle's ethics. And the other was humaneness. And Vinay convinced me of the importance of this. We talked about the orders of humaneness quite a bit in our chats, our Zoom chats, and so on. They are kind of a two-way or even a 360-degree way of looking at your relationship to others and to yourself. And they are a good way of staying on track for actualizing yourself in your life. You can't really fully actualize your life without paying proper respect to others, and you cannot do it either without paying proper respect to yourself and making your life the fullest it can be. And I agree that as we worked together, we did bounce a lot of ideas off each other. We were each other's best critic, and sometimes we were our own best critic. We'd say, "Oh, I rethought this. I need to run it by you. What do you think?" So it was great. It was a lot of synergy, and the synergy was just tremendous.
Fantastic. That gives a bit of insight into how you worked together and what your goals were. You wrote the chapter on that gives us an overview of Aristotle's thought, and there are, of course, many mistakes that Aristotle
Yep.
made because of the time that he lived in. For instance, he didn't have very good ideas about women and slavery, for example. But these are historical digressions and not really the essence of Aristotle's fundamentals. Can you go over the fundamentals briefly and why they are so important?
Well, yeah, I do want to say one thing before I get to that, and that's that Aristotle had a very interesting idea of the relationship of the individual to the community. Uh, Unlike Plato, I think he didn't treat the community as more important than the individual, but he did think that the community was essential to your living your own best life as an individual. There's a certain amount of participation in the community and in the economy and conforming to the pattern and the rules and procedures that are required just by that. And there are, of course, some boundaries or limits. There are some excesses that, if you're a reasonable person, you should not tolerate them. And when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he was explaining why we were breaking with our British cousins, it was that kind of situation exactly. But in general, there are these wonderful benefits of living among others, like friendship and trade and knowledge, and it's such a great cluster of benefits that it's almost a no-brainer to stay in even a mediocre society where you have a mixed economy and government rather than just run off and live in the forest by yourself. I don't think it occurred to Aristotle that people would find social living to be objectionable just because it wasn't fully, or if it wasn't fully libertarian. Now, putting that aside, I want to answer your question. Uh, Aristotle's insight into human beings was that they're not only rational beings, but they're social beings, and that's very important. His psychology and his biology is all focused on those facts, and he made some very important identifications, and Thomas Aquinas picked up on these too, that there's at least three crucial aspects of all successful life. There's survival and there's flourishing. And these two we've heard a lot about over the years, but there's also what we might call generativity or legacy, whether they're the same thing or different. We could talk about that, but they are the essential parts of living the fullest life. If you want to have a meaningful and a humane life as a rational and social animal. Um, what else about Aristotle? Well, he was a realist. He was a naturalist. I don't mean he was a cynical realist. I mean he looked right here at the real world here, right here on Earth. We have the ability to know it by using our senses and our reasoning, and that things have a nature and they act according to their nature. So there, right there, are the concepts of identity and causality. And this is just bedrock stuff, bedrock essential points if you want to have a philosophy and if you want to have sciences based on facts so that you can discover truth about the world and use it to guide your life. So he also thought that principles for thinking and acting, in other words, what we call method, is very important to philosophy and science and to living well in general. You can see this all through his philosophy, his laws of logic. He defined the principles of definition and in deductive logic. The syllogism came from him. His stress on how important inductive reasoning is and dialectics as a way to resolve intellectual disputes and to fortify our first principles, our axioms. Uh, I don't think Aristotle's gotten full credit for just how important these foundational facts and method is for his ethics. He didn't just do like some people say he did and just kind of take a survey of what the good men did. He also looked more broadly at all living beings, and he saw that there were certain things that they all had in common in order to live well. So he was really fact based. He was very scientific and methodical, very thorough in understanding life and what are the real requirements for each creature that plant, animal, human needs to have the fullest life.
Oh, great. You mentioned human nature and Aristotle's take on human nature. Vinay, you actually wrote the next chapter, which is called The Essence of Human Nature. You write about humans as introspecting animals, and you argue that this is what sets man apart from the other animals. And you also go on to speculate that perhaps the introspective human is in fact a new subspecies of Homo sapiens. I found that quite a fascinating idea, and I wonder if you can elaborate on that point and about man as an introspecting animal.
Oh, thank you, Marco. Yeah, you're right. The human mind is capable of reminiscing the past and planning the future, and we do so by talking to oneself. So the mind creates an identity of itself, mind and body, inside the virtual mind space. And we can also observe our own mental state, which we call introspection. And that's a huge leap. The one question has not been answered by the theory of evolution, which is when did this process actually take place? So, paleontologists say that Homo sapiens, or human beings, arose roughly 160,000 years ago. Linguists say language arose only 30,000 years ago. So, how did we speak to ourselves before 30,000 years ago? And we can't do so without any kind of language. And those languages are rudimentary, they didn't survive to this day. Now, Julian Jaynes was a Princeton psychologist, and he published his magnum opus in 1976. And he has some jaw-dropping theories that it's one of those theories is human beings did not develop an ability for introspection till about 30,000 to 3,500 years ago. And of course, the lower limit is highly controversial. So the subspecies is really an analogy. So if you had a time traveling machine, and you took a human being from 100,000 years ago, he or she would be compatible with the rest of the human race. They will be able to bear children or, start a family. But it's such a different species that I end up calling it a subspecies. Mind you, even Ayn Rand speculated that the chasm between apes and humans was so large, she felt distinctly uncomfortable about it. And James, I think, would have given her the answer.
Oh, yeah, it's an interesting topic, fascinating topic.
Yeah, it is. Sorry, just one thing to add. So what happened was, like, if you go into the brain, there's no substrate or material that accounts for consciousness. So it's like the brain's a computer. No hardware has changed when consciousness came in, but there is a massive, huge software upgrade, which is language.
I always like the comparison of the brain and the mind to computers, and there's a lot of revolutionary stuff in science today that goes a long way to explaining how the brain works. Roger, in you quote extensively from the throughout the book from Ayn Rand, and more or less on par with Aristotle. But you also say that even though our own ethical and political models differ in significant respects to Ayn Rand's, it's instructive to see how congruent her ethical values and virtues are with the pillars of her metaphysical optimism. Can you elaborate on this? Where do their ideas diverge and where do they converge?
Oh, sure. Um, there are some points where I strongly agree with her, and some where I go further than she did. Uh, you referred to her metaphysical optimism. I think that's another good uh, point about that was her particular position on deep meaning about the world and life. Whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the world and life, I guess there are four main views, and they even have an A and B, so there's like four times two. And I'll just run through them real quickly. First, 1A, her own view was the world is intelligible, and 1B is humans are capable of knowing it. 2A, the world is open to human effort, and 2B, humans are capable of acting and achieving goals. 3A, the world is worth the effort we put into knowing and acting, and 3B, humans are capable of being good and living a good life. And 4, the world is emotionally worth the effort. And 4A, human beings are capable of feeling good about themselves and their lives. Now, because a person can take a positive or negative view on any of these, um, I was running through the combinations the other day, and I said, "Wow, there are 16 possible worldviews," but I really think there's 256. if you go 1A positive, 1B negative, or just mix them and match them, there's all these possibilities. And I know that not everybody had this sparkling positive take across the board. The human race is a lot of mixed people. I don't want to say mixed up. Some of them are, but mixed. We have a lot of variation, a lot of. Now, a person can take, if you use Rand's view as the foundation for an ethics, I think it goes straight across into the objectivist ethics. If you know the world, that translates into the cardinal value of reason and the virtue of rationality. Achieving values, that translates into purpose and productiveness. If your actions and character are worthy, that translates into self-esteem and pride. And if you feel good about yourself and your life, that translates into what Rand said was the moral purpose of your life, which is happiness. Now, one way I go beyond Rand is I see that ambition is not just involved in pride, which he called moral ambitiousness, but also in rationality and productiveness. Intellectual ambition, you want to know more and more. You don't ever say, well, I think I have learned enough. I'm just going to coast the rest of my life and do Sudoku puzzles or something. And for a practical ambition, wanting to achieve more, why would you ever stop? I mean, if all you do is to tighten the screws, I guess maybe you'd get arthritis and want to quit. But generally speaking, why wouldn't you want to keep doing and keep learning? It just seems like that's part of being human. Even pursuit of happiness. Now, I think that's a virtue. Rand doesn't mention it as a virtue, but I think that's an exercise of ambition. You can only be truly happy, in my opinion, if you exercise rationality and productiveness and pride. So let me say a couple things about her politics. I used to think Rand's politics was based on her own ethics, but I don't anymore. And I really get the argument that some people are making that you can't just go directly from her reason, purpose, self-esteem into limited government and individual rights. I think it's not her ethics, but what she identifies as being true about any ethical system, whatever. Ethics, by definition, no matter whether it's a Christian ethics, the Nazi ethics, the objectivist ethics, the utilitarians, by definition, it means freely chosen action. And you cannot consistently demand freedom of action for yourself without granting it to everyone else. And so that's how free thought, free speech, free market, etc., logically follows from the very nature of ethics, and not from objectivist ethics, but just from what ethics requires. I don't think Rand made that connection clear enough. I think you can find it in her journals. You can pick little things here and there that help make the case, but she really didn't spell that out, I think. And so many of her followers have been looking in the wrong place for the bedrock, the foundation of her politics. Like I said, it's in the nature of morality. One other point, quick point. I've got a deeper analysis that I think than Rand did of the political spectrum. One result of that is that I find that the politics and economics of objectivism is essentially compatible with libertarianism, libertarian politics, and Austrian economics, and that they're not at odds with each other as Rand and some objectivists, and I would also say some Thomists and Aristotelians would claim.
Okay.
Interesting thoughts. There's quite a difference between, you contrasted politics and our ethics, and there's quite a difference between Atlas Shrugged, which is very political, and The Fountainhead, which is more psychological. And one of the focuses in The Fountainhead is on self-actualization, on being your true self. Would you describe Rand's ethics as being more an ethic of self-actualization than egoism?
Well, if I know what's good for me, I will, yes. That's one of the points of our book. Maybe we didn't underscore it enough, but sure. For a human being, say whether it's you or I or Vinay or Howard Rourke, if you're going to self-actualize, that means to live up to your potential as a rational being, a rational social being, to live well as the particular individual, the particular human individual that you are. There are some other aspects of her ethics that are not fundamental, but are still indispensable. And there's a difference between what you can't do without and what is the foundation. Like in geometry, the foundation is like the parallel postulate and the other axioms. But then you get down there several weeks later, you get down to the Pythagorean theorem, and you say, well, how could we do geometry without the Pythagorean theorem? And yet it's not an axiom. It's not a fundamental. It's just something that's indispensable, you know? So, and I think one of the things that is indispensable to Rand's ethics is egoism, even though she said it is not a fundamental issue, like who benefits. That's not the fundamental. The fundamental is your individual life as a rational being is the most important value in your life, and every action you take should support it. It should not undercut it or neglect it. So we could call it a corollary. We could say egoism or rational selfishness. That was a term that they use also. It's a corollary of self-actualization. Life is man qua man. But you couldn't really give a solid validation or support for rational selfishness if you didn't have that basic support under it, which is self-actualization. She also discusses another part that is indispensable, I think, and that's she took a firm stand against hedonism. She said morality should not be based on seeking pleasure. It's not wrong to have pleasure and enjoyment, but if you aim at that, that can undercut your self-actualization and living by the pleasure motive. So both of these are vitally necessary conditions to be a fully self-actualized person. So Rand's ethics, we can describe her ethics as egoistic. We can also say it's anti-hedonistic. But the best description of her ethics is self-actualization. What is in your best interest as a rational being who seeks to live well? It's not false to say it's egoistic. It's not false to say it's anti-hedonistic any more than if somebody says, well, is Rand's metaphysics atheistic? Well, yeah, but that's not the core of it. Or what about our politics? Is it capitalism? Yes, but that's not the core of it. The foundation idea in all these areas is the best way of describing them. Like her metaphysics is basically realist. There's a real world there, and we have real knowledge of it. Her politics is basically individualistic, individual rights, and her ethics is also individualistic. Some call it self-perfectionism or self-actualization, or eudaimonism is the term that Aristotle used. And I think David Norton in his book, whatever the name of that book was.
Personal destinies is something like that.
Thank you. putting the focus on these other ideas, egoism or atheism or capitalism, just doesn't get at the core of her philosophy, and it's bound to be misleading. And I don't like to mislead people.
Let's continue here with Vinay on, you discuss David Hume's is-ought gap. And can you briefly describe or explain what the is-ought gap is and how you both got around this conundrum?
Okay. Now, as far as I know, Hume's is-ought gap has 4 names to it: is-ought gap, Hume's fork, Hume's guillotine, and and Hume's paradox. And there's also a controversy over what Hume actually meant. So let me go through what I think he meant. He says moral philosophers often talk about things as they are, about facts. And then they switch suddenly, like a magician's sleight of hand. The hat goes up, the rabbit is gone, kind of sleight of hand. And they shift to normative or prescriptive or ought to do statements. And that shouldn't happen, because we cannot derive ought just from the ease. They should be based on the ease and the facts. So let's say, lions need to hunt in order to survive. That's a fact. Then we say, therefore, lions should hunt. Well, what's the hidden ought in there? Which is that lions should survive. Or we can, to gain happiness, we must use reason. Therefore, we must use reason. But wait, there is another hidden ought there, which is, do we want to be happy? Maybe not. So that's the way it actually plays out in practice. So all that Hume is asking us to do is to make that bridge explicit, and we did so. And it's a bit like there are 2 fields, and you got to build a bridge: the field of ought to do's and the fields of facts. And the only way to connect them, because otherwise they're like Kipling's East and West, never the twain shall meet. The only way to connect them is to have a bridge. And our bridge is, we should want to make our lives meaningful. It is within us to do so, and there are substantial correlated benefits to mental and physical health and longevity. So we made meaningfulness both our standard and our end goal in ethics. That's our bridge. We make it explicit. And you might remember Rand, for instance, as she's forced to commit to a different standard, man qua man, and a different end goal, which is arguably both survival and flourishing and happiness. So yeah, you can't get around the paradox, but you got to acknowledge it. And like a fork, you say, that's the bridge I built. Be explicit.
Can I just add a brief note to that? I'd like to do that. Renee pointed out how Rand, early in her thinking, like maybe in the Objectivist Ethics, was talking about, without naming Hume, she was the is-ought problem. And she wrote an essay fairly late in her career called Causality versus Duty. And instead of Hume's problem, she was looking at Immanuel Kant, who laid out these, well, you just should do this, period. No, if you want to, or if you need it, or whatever, just you should. And so I think she was so focused on dealing with that problem that maybe she didn't realize that she had come around to Hume's way of thinking. I really do think she made a move toward realizing that there are not just bald facts, but there are conditional facts. If you want X, then you have to do Y. And do you want X? Well, if you do, then you have to do Y. It's just as simple. You plug facts in that are, some are straight facts, some are conditionals, like an if-then statement. So I really think she changed her thinking without
Realizing it?
without realizing, or without maybe some of us realizing how far she had turned.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Roger, can you describe what you mean by a full life, and why is this necessary for ethics?
Sure. It's more than just having a lot of food to eat at dinner. uh, in chapter 4 of the book, I talk about Aristotle and Aquinas and others, what they've identified as, I call them levels of development. But once you get rolling, as you're a teenager and adult, you're working on all of them together. Okay, the personal level, the interpersonal, and then the institutional level is where we're talking about the economy and the political system. We're not just lone wolf rational animals. We are social rational animals. We're not Robinson Crusoe and all that. If you're a hermit who sticks to yourself and you're physically and mentally well developed, but you kind of socially dysfunctional and you don't have any close ties to friends or family, or you're not really very good at working with others in the economy or functioning in the community you live in, your life just isn't as full as it can be. And so that, by the way, is one reason why we included the chapter on politics in our book. If you're going to have a fully humane and meaningful life, a life that's fully self-actualized, fully rational, individualist life, you have to be in a social context. I already underscored that. As long as you have somewhere to go that it's not just everything is totalitarian slave societies like in Orwell's book 1984. But each of those 6 stages is vital to your fullest life, to your maximum actualizing of yourself. Obviously, you have to survive, but life is a lot more than just not physically dying. You have to thrive and develop and expand your mental and physical abilities and your vitality. So that's flourishing. And there's the issue of what do you do about other people? Well, you start in on that as you're quite young. You relate to mama and daddy and siblings and friends, and so that's an ongoing process. So as you work at becoming creative and productive and figuring out what you most want to do, you're going to want to interact with and trade values with others. Some of them will be material and economic values. Some of them will be social or spiritual and personal values. I've used this metaphor of a nation. I don't think I talked about it in the book, but the nation is born and it kind of takes roots, and then it grows and expands, and then it reaches out and trades with other nations economically and culturally. And this third level is what I call generativity. And this term's been around for quite a while. I think Aquinas used it or something like it. And then there's a term called legacy, and we've tossed this around quite a bit too. I think we have 2 kinds of legacy. One is genetic legacy, which is where you have your own offspring or the close relatives, like if you're the doting uncle or aunt and you have your favorite nephews and so on. But not only the genetic legacy, but the non-genetic legacy, like what have you created that you pass on to others after you've ended your career or you've died. And so generativity is like during or before you die, and then legacy is after. So I like the fact that you have these 2 distinct concepts that are very closely related, but they cover distinct parts of your life. And then finally, what we get into in chapter 6, I partly touch on it toward the end of chapter 4 about the economy and what we call, polity was Aristotle's term, but the community, I would say. And as I think I said a couple of minutes ago, these areas are not hermetically sealed. It's not like, well, I'm going to work on this. No, they're very interconnected. And by the time you're an adult, you have your hands really full balancing all of these areas with each other. And they're going to be value conflicts. And part of what we hope to work on some more going forward is techniques or ways to balance your conflicting values or competing values and to work out value conflicts.
I think we'll move on now to what I consider the centerpiece of the book, and that is what you call the 4 orders of humaneness. Vinay, where did that concept come from? And can you explain briefly what the four orders of humaneness are?
Thank you for taking an deep interest in it. I had been thinking maybe for years on humanism and humaneness. And I so concluded that objectivism is in fact a form of humanism. And uh, Roger convinced me libertarianism is as well of the same form, a form of humanism. And on my early drafts of these four orders of humaneness, I had three and then expanded to four, but I received a lot of excellent feedback from Roger. So thank you, Roger, for that. So what we have is the first two orders are matters of principle, and the next two orders are matters of practice. So the first order humane life is one in which we properly respect and take care of oneself, one's own humanity, one's passions and desires, of being in touch with ourselves, of using our emotions as clues to cognition. So a first order humane life, resents being used by others. It doesn't allow ourselves to become mental slaves or be bullied, etc. The second order humane life is it accords all other human beings the same dignity, respect, frankness as one ought to accord oneself, as ends in themselves, deserving of not being lied to, of not being manipulated, neither masters nor slaves, neither guardians nor wards, neither mentors or mentees. And mind you, even our wards or children deserve that same principle, being ends in themselves. And there are two exceptions. One is, I call it a terrorism or Immanuel Kant exception. Uh, the terrorist, we don't owe the truth to the terrorist. And you can also surprise people with birthday parties, surprise birthdays or whatever. That's a sort of a mild exception to always speaking the truth. Now the third order humaneness is practicing getting in touch with yourself, of being better at recognizing your own emotion, your passion, of forgiving oneself for past errors, and developing the skill of introspection and making it better, making your self-assessment better and better. And the fourth order humaneness, again, is practice of the second order of developing empathy, of being able to read other people well, because a lot of tragedy happens when we don't. So they are the kind of four orders of humaneness. And in the fourth order, we also got to realize that sometimes we have a large influential effect if we are seen as the powerful other, as the parent by a young child, or could have a halo effect of a celebrity. If we are one, I think none of us are at the moment, so we won't have that kind of halo effect. But they're the four orders.
Continuing on that theme, you discussed errors that people can make in their thinking, and you argue that these errors are often caused by violating one of the four orders of humaneness. In particular, you mentioned Viktor Frankl, and he had the opportunity to. He got an American visa and had an opportunity to leave Austria, but he decided to stay with his family. And you argue that this was a mistake on his part. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, it's a very difficult circumstance to analyze. So, first of all, when we analyze a decision, any decision, we have to say either the effects of the decision are past us and we can take the full benefit of hindsight, or we say, was the decision prudent when looking at it from that time span? You didn't know what was going to happen in the future. You might buy Microsoft shares and they go up, and well, it looks great. Did you do it right when you did it? So let's look at the facts as I know them. I'll present them as I know them. In Before America entered the war in 1941, that's when the opportunity arose for Viktor Frankl with his visa. And by that stage, Hitler had already annexed Austria. He did so in 1938. They knew Victor's family was all Jewish. His father, mother, brother, sister, and himself, three siblings. And they knew what was going to happen to Jews. So what's the possible response? One is a morally upright option could be to join the Austrian resistance. Everyone takes up arms and fights the Nazis. Not likely to succeed, except you might kill a few Nazis before you die. Other is to sit at home with guns until the dreaded knock comes on the door and then shoot. You would die in a shootout, maybe take a few Nazis down with you. Another option is to escape. Now, his brother and sister did try to escape. The sister succeeded. She crossed over into Italy, eventually got a visa to Australia, and lived a life in Melbourne. The brother didn't succeed. He was caught and put to death. He and his parents were taken to concentration camp. His mother and Victor were in Auschwitz, and the father was sent to another concentration camp. And what the Nazis always did was to separate the families. So they had no idea what had happened to the other person. Frankel was moved again to another concentration camp. He spent 3 years in these camps, where he said right at the outset 90% of people were killed because they were deemed not big enough to do the work or strong enough to do the kind of work they put them through. Of the remaining 10%, another 90 of 10 were eventually died out of starvation or disease and stuff like that. So your chance of recovery or survival was 1%, and miraculously he did so. But when he took the decision to not take the American visa, a synagogue had been destroyed by the Nazis. His father went there, found a stone, brought it home, and he looked at the stone, Victor did, and said, "What does the stone say?" And it had just a Hebrew letter. I think it was the letter 5. The fifth commandment says, "Honor thy father and mother, and your days shall be long upon the land." And Victor took that as a divine sign, and it worked out well for him in a sense. I mean, the father and mother did die, the brother did die, sister succeeded because she took a different decision. And looking at that Victor's decision, he could have gone to America as a highly influential professor, and perhaps as America entered the war, he had better chances then of rescuing his parents. That's why I think it was wrong.
It's an interesting thought, and I know that I don't entirely agree with you, but we won't get into that at this time. One of the interesting aspects of your book is that you digress on and analyze the Ayn Rand Nathaniel Branden split as one of these errors of thought. I'd like to hear from both of you on this. Vinay, how would you analyze that split from the Four Orders perspective?
Thank you. Again, as in the Frankel case, let's start with one, the assumed set of facts. And my source for that is Barbara Branden's book, which is controversial among some people. And same like Frankel, you have to look at the decision and what happened at that point in time. Fortuitously, Frankel's book became a bestseller later on because of that concentration camp experience in which he would have died. So the facts, as I know them, was Rand was around 50 and she'd finished The Fountainhead. She was writing Atlas Shrugged. She was drawn intellectually to Nathaniel Branden at that time, 25 years younger than her and a budding psychologist. And she had a theory of sexuality which basically meant that if you saw the highest values in a man, if you were a woman and vice versa, you are bound to get sexually as well attracted to them. And so she believed it is not just a mentor-mentee relationship between her and Nathaniel, but they ought to have a romantic and sexual relationship, which they started, and it was on and off for roughly 13 years. And one of the last things she said to Barbara when the relationship broke, I'll quote, "If you ever," she's addressing Nathaniel, "if you ever for even a moment had been the man you pretended to be, you would value me romantically above any woman on earth, even if I were 80 and in a wheelchair. You would be blind to any other women." And I think that Nathaniel had absorbed this, and in theory of sexuality, he had introjected all of what Rand said unconditionally. She had the halo effect. He thought at that time probably every word of objectivism is true. He therefore suffered guilt. But when Rand had put the affair on hold because of her own depression, he had started another affair anyway. So he failed in third order of humaneness to understand oneself completely, to reconcile the fact that his emotions were not in accordance with Rand's theory. Therefore, the theory was probably wrong rather than he was wrong. And Rand, on her part, I think, failed at the fourth order because as she was a genius, but she failed to understand that one was a halo effect, and two, what was actually going on for that many years with Nathaniel. So that's about it.
Roger, can you add to that by sort of discussing what you think are the consequences of that split on the objectivist movement? What were the repercussions of the split?
Well, actually, I'd like to uh, trace or add a little bit to what Vinay said leading up to the split, and then as well as the aftermath. Okay. Um, Now, I have to preface this. I didn't meet, no, I never met Ayn Rand personally. I only met Nathaniel like in the late 90s, long after all this. I read both Nathaniel's autobiography and Barbara's biography of Rand, and I also read James Valiant's edited version of Rand's journals, private journals during this time. So I've kind of got both sides. I've read a lot of analysis, and this is my own personal take after reflecting on all that material. Um, and like I said, I didn't know them personally. This is like second or third hand, right? Uh, I think the cause was a combination of naivety and hubris. When I say naive, they even Nathaniel being a young psychologist, they didn't understand psychological dynamics of when you're married to somebody else and you're trying to have this relationship. What's going to happen? What kind of damage will it do? I think there was a failure of honesty and self-awareness too, and that gets into the orders of humaneness that Renee was talking about. I think also they were not only attracted to each other intellectually, but I think they were, if I may say, they were sexually frustrated. I think Nathaniel and Barbara both revealed that they weren't having a really great romantic relationship in their marriage. And also, I think Rand was not totally fulfilled in her marriage. And so I think they were both looking for something, and during that period of their lives, they found it in each other. I think the age gap wasn't as significant at that point as it later turned out to be. It was a big mistake, I think. Once it cooled down, they should have let it go. But Rand decided she was going to press really hard to get it going once everything was back on a good, even keel emotionally for her. She was doing essays and lectures and feeling more optimistic. And she didn't understand why it wasn't appropriate or emotionally viable. The orders of humaneness come in there again. And Brandon really blew it. He failed from the standpoint of courage. He failed from the standpoint of honesty. He tried to extricate himself by not by covering up his true feelings for this other woman who became his next wife, and also his lack of romantic feelings. He said, "Oh, he wanted to feel those feelings." Well, he didn't want to feel those feelings, so he was lying. I think that's why the breakup was inevitable. The breakup of the movement. The movement was centered around those two people, and if they couldn't hold it together, then it was going to crash. I don't think, and now for consequences, I don't think it was an unmitigated disaster. While in the early days before the split, there was a lot of intellectual bullying going on. There was something like a cancel culture that was going on in Rand's circle. And after the split, there was a large number of those who were really more loyal to Nathaniel Brandon, who went with him and left that toxic environment. So I think there was quite a bit of good that was done. But on the other hand, all this intellectual synergy that Rand and Brandon and the others had, that really broke apart. And the creative output of the movement also declined, except for Leonard Peikoff's very prolific work with his lectures. I don't think there was much of significance that came out of the movement over the next 2 decades or so. And then David Kelly split off around 1990. He initiated open objectivism, and even at that, I don't think there was a significant increase in dynamic progress. And I think that's still true today. Rand said, not long before she died, that her philosophy was not complete, and it wouldn't be complete before she died, and there'd be plenty of work for others to do. Well, that sounds great. Yeah, dial me in on that. I want to help. But the keepers of the flame, the Ayn Rand Institute, they declared in 1990 there shall be no new objectivism, period, not even filling in gaps that they all knew were there. And this was, she passed in 1982, and 1990 was when they declared objectivism is closed. So now here we are, what, almost 25 years after open objectivism started. And I don't think anything new has been officially added to what Kelly in 1990 called a young philosophy. I know that sounds like I'm gloom and doom, the decline and fall of objectivism, but I'm afraid that's kind of in slow motion what we're seeing. Objectivism was one of the selling points to me. Was not only is it true, it's a really good perspective on life in the world, but it's also a wonderful tool, powerful engine for intellectual progress, moral and social progress. But I think that was its potential. And instead, because of the closed policies, the closed mindedness, the gatekeeper mentalities, and so on, the philosophy has been kept sequestered, almost like the Virgin up in the turret of the castle, and we will keep it pure at all costs. And look, over the last 20 or 30 years, look how much incredible boost to thinking and to communication that we've gotten from the computer and the internet. But despite that, you could think, well, maybe that would save the movement. But I still see it's gradually kind of fading. And what I thank Vinay for this point. I thank him for this point. Nathaniel Branden once called it a movement of young souls. Well, that was us 40, 50 years ago. Guess what? Now, I think this movement is withering away. It's kind of an inverted pyramid of baby boomers. And what's going to happen when we're gone? I wish it weren't true. I desperately wish that we were just on the verge of a new golden age, and we're going to see stunning breakthroughs, intellectual and technological breakthroughs by people who have been thoroughly steeped in these objectivist ideas. But I don't see it, and because of that, I am very sad.
That's an interesting perspective. I'm not sure I agree with you on that the movement is withering away. Rand's books continue to sell in the hundreds of thousands every year. And I think she will, in the future, be recognized as one of the great writers of all time. And also, I think that your book here, Modernizing Aristotle's Ethics, adds to the objectivist corpus, whether Peikoff and the hard line closed objectivist people agree with it or not. I think it's an important contribution to the open objectivist movement.
Thank you.
I'd like to continue or conclude actually with the book primarily is on ethics. Most of it, all the chapters except one deal with ethics, but your last chapter, you diverge a bit and you go into politics. Why did you decide to go into politics? And let's start with Vinay on that one.
Okay. Firstly, thank you, Marco. Roger ended the last question with saying, I'm really sad. And then you made him smile and laugh. So you're very good at the fourth order of humaneness. We went into politics, from my perspective, to show that all politics, every government policy has an implied ethical framework, whether we make it explicit or not, like that, getting around Hume's fork. And it's not surprising in our politics, we came out very heavily in favor of free speech and free markets. And I want to bring one other aspect which Roger emphasized in his talk today, as well as in the book, that we are social animals. And in terms of us being social, when we define values, we have some extended definitions that differ from Rand's. One of them is of universal potential values. And universal potential values recognize that we are rational social animals who live in societies, that material abundance is only possible by division of labor. And the state of medicine, science, health, and technological progress would be in dire straits without a systematic, legally enforceable organization of division of labor and protection of individual rights, including property. So, what are the universal potential values? We say universal potential values are ones that nudge any society toward a higher state of humanism or knowledge. So we increase the world's real knowledge in any field, however slight. We we influence other individual minds to lead or consider leading humane, meaningful lives, or we add to the world's reservoir of romanticist art, or plead for victims of injustice, or fight for humaneness in any institution. Because, again, as Roger points out, we cannot flourish by ourselves living in a forest like Henry David Thoreau or on an island like Robinson Crusoe. In the entire history of mankind, since the fable came out, there have been very few real Robinson Crusoes who chose to live on an island by themselves, and even then they came back in a few years. So that's I think that's all from me on why we chose to extend into politics.
Roger, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Well, this is going to agree quite a bit with what Vinay said, and not really disagree. I think you can't present an ethics for living well strictly in personal terms or even in personal and social terms. If you want to live well, I maintain you can't live well in the fullest sense without taking part in a division of labor economy and at least some extent on the local level of the political structure. If we're able-bodied, we cannot live as unproductive parasites, living off the generosity of others or the forced labor of others. Just as important, we can't live with our heads in the sand. We can't be oblivious to threats to our personal liberty. We can't rely on the elected officials to do the job alone. We're going to be the ultimate check and balance on if the government is doing something wrong or just being generally incompetent. And if we're asleep at the switch and we don't exercise what Jefferson called eternal vigilance, then we'll share the blame if the country descends into a tyranny. So there is an old bumper sticker slogan, "Don't blame me, I voted." Well, this is a much more profound principle. Don't blame me, I engaged with the culture. I engaged with the society. Think of Dagny when she had burned out totally, and she went to live at the cabin or in the woods or whatever, and she needed to recharge partly, but she thought, I just can't stand this anymore. What they're doing to the world and to my business. But once she started feeling like herself again, she couldn't stand it anymore. She had to do something. So she, and it wasn't just being purposeful and active, but also I think she wanted to be back engaging with whatever few productive, rational, moral people there were. And so she couldn't do that being living off in the woods. So that's kind of why I use that little metaphor. I like the Thoreau reference too. Now, I discussed some of that in chapter 4, and then Vinay and I really went through it thoroughly in our final chapter. So there is a good connection between chapters 4 and 6 on this point, and I do hope readers will grab onto it.
Well, I'd like to thank you both. Do either of you have a last word before we conclude the show?
I know Vinay does.
Not quite. I mean, just to add at the end to what Roger said, we have commandments as well. But there's only 3 secular commandments, and they're not divine. They're just I driving me in the Jansian sense. 1, construct a meaning for your life and commit to it. test it objectively using the principles outlined in the book, but you test it subjectively. Is this the thing of all the humane things, of all the mission things that I can do? Is that bringing out my passion? So you should be passionate about it, but test it objectively, which, for instance, Greta Thunberg doesn't. She's committed, and that lifted her out of depression. She's committed to a mission, but it's a wrong mission, objectively speaking. The second commandment is to strive to be human in all four orders, commit to the principles of the first two orders, so you won't go wrong in the first two, and try to improve your introspection and your ability to understand others. And third is to self actualize, developing our 7 key faculties that we speak about, rationality, introspection, tenacity, capacity for joy, goodwill and empathy, wisdom, and resilience. Develop that in accordance with your mission, and that's your self actualization. That's all from me.
Sure. I'll put a cap on it here. I'll try to do it in 90 seconds. I hope we don't run out of tape. Ha ha. The humane part of what we're aiming at, I would summarize it as 1 part Apollo and 1 part Jesus. Know thyself. That was the Delphic oracle at the temple of Apollo. And know the others who matter to you. And respect thy neighbor as thyself. There's the Jesus part. Identify what's going on in your thoughts and feelings and behavior. Don't sweep them under the rug, and the same for the other people you deal with. Don't abuse others and yourself, and don't allow others to abuse you. And when it's appropriate, try to encourage them not to abuse themselves. The meaningfulness part, I think, is 1 part Ayn Rand, and he might be uncomfortable with this, but I think Vinay Kolhatkar is a big part of my understanding of this. There's deep meaning. To identify what life and the world are all about, what they mean to you, what's important to you about them in a very broad way. And then there's your core personal meaning, what you want your life to mean, to amount to, your central purpose, your mission in life. So it's the meaning of life and the meaning of your life. And I think that pretty well summarizes it for me, what we were trying to do in the book.
Well, on that note, I'd like to just conclude by saying that this is an excellent book, and if you have the opportunity to buy it, it's a bit expensive at this moment, but there's going to be a paperback edition out in July, which should be at a lower price. And I highly recommend the book, and I encourage everybody to go and get a copy. And on that note, thank you for being here, and thank you to our audience for listening. And a good evening to you, or a good
Thank
morning,
you so
whatever
much.
the time may be. Okay.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you.
Thank you.